Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Tea Time Mysteries. I'm Edward, your conductor on this particular journey. Tonight we board the Midland Christmas Express, a train bound for the north through December snow carrying holiday cheer and something far more sinister. Tell me, have you ever wondered what secrets travel alongside strangers in a first-class compartment? A locked door, a missing dispatch case, and the unmistakable scent of bitter almonds await us. Do subscribe, there are many stations ahead. Now settle into your seat, the departure whistle sounds. As Poirot reminds us, the train, she waits for no one, but the truth? That is patient. Chapter 1. Departure from Victoria. The great clock at Victoria Station stood at 2:30, its hands pointing with Victorian solemnity toward the grey December sky beyond the vaulted glass roof. Snow fell in thick, determined flakes, settling upon the shoulders of porters and passengers alike, transforming the bustling terminus into a scene that might have graced a Christmas card, were it not for the very real inconvenience of the weather. Hercule Poirot, his moustaches protected beneath a silk scarf of a particularly pleasing shade of burgundy, surveyed the platform with the air of a general inspecting his troops before battle. The Midland Christmas Express stood ready, its dark green carriages gleaming despite the gloom, steam rising from beneath its wheels and ghostly plumes. The first-class compartments were filling rapidly with those fortunate souls who possessed both the means and the inclination to travel north for the festive season. Poirot himself was bound for Yorkshire, where an old acquaintance had invited him to spend Christmas at a country house of reportedly excellent comfort. The prospect pleased him. Order, warmth, good food, and the company of civilized people. What more could a man desire during the season of goodwill? He had just handed his small but immaculately packed valise to a porter when a commotion near the first-class entrance caught his attention. A tall, distinguished gentleman of perhaps 60 years was remonstrating with a guard about the security of the luggage van. The gentleman possessed that unmistakable bearing of the English upper classes, broad shoulders, erect posture, and a voice accustomed to being obeyed. In one hand he gripped a leather dispatch case of exceptional quality, which he clutched as though it contained the crown jewels themselves. A young woman at his elbow spoke in soothing tones. She was perhaps 30, possessed of a pleasant, open countenance, and dressed with quiet good taste in a travelling suit of dark blue wool. The porter assisting Poirot noticed his interest. "You'll be travelling with quality today, sir. That's Sir Gerald Ashford, big man in shipping. Made a fortune in the war, they say, though not everyone approves of how it was done." The porter's tone suggested that he himself numbered among the disapprovers, but Poirot merely nodded and proceeded to his compartment. He had learned long ago that porters knew more about the private affairs of their betters than was entirely comfortable to contemplate. The compartment was all that could be desired. Plush seats of deep crimson, polished wood fittings, and a small table beneath the window. Poirot arranged himself with his customary precision, removing his overcoat, adjusting the antimacassar, and placing his travelling case in the overhead rack with geometrical exactitude. He had scarcely settled when the door slid open to admit a gentleman of military bearing, accompanied by a veritable cloud of pipe smoke. "Colonel Henry Blake," the newcomer announced, extending a hand. "I say, you don't mind if I join you? The carriage is frightfully full." Poirot did mind, but good manners prevailed. "Hercule Poirot, please be seated." The colonel installed himself with much rustling of newspapers and muttering about the weather, the railways, and the general decline of everything since the war. He was a large man, red of face and bluff in manner, with the kind of moustache that suggested long service in India. Travelling far. The colonel inquired, loading his pipe with fresh tobacco. "To Yorkshire, monsieur." I'm from Manchester myself. Business, you know. Can't let Christmas interfere with one's obligations. What?" Before Poirot could respond, a steward appeared at the door. "Gentlemen, the dining carriage will be serving tea in approximately 1 hour. Meanwhile, Might I offer you anything for your comfort?" The train lurched and began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering confidence. Victoria Station receded into the snow-swirled distance. The journey had begun. As they cleared the suburbs of London, the countryside unfolded in shades of white and grey. Fields lay blanketed in snow, hedgerows bore their winter burdens with stoic resignation, and the occasional cottage sent up a plume of smoke that spoke of warmth and shelter. Poirot occupied himself by gazing out of the window, while Colonel Blake buried himself in the Times, occasionally grunting at some item that displeased him. It was perhaps 40 minutes into the journey when the door slid open once more. A woman entered, or rather hesitated, at the threshold. She was perhaps 50, dressed entirely in black, with anxious eyes and hands that twisted a handkerchief ceaselessly. "I do beg your pardon," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Might there be room? The other compartments are so very crowded." Colonel Blake lowered his newspaper with evident reluctance. "I suppose there's space enough, madam." The woman settled herself with much nervous adjustment of skirts and bags. "Mrs. Edith Carroway," she offered, addressing neither gentleman in particular. The colonel grunted. "Blake, and this is Mr. Poirot." "Monsieur Poirot," the detective corrected gently. "Enchanted, madame." Mrs. Carroway appeared on the verge of tears, though about what Poirot could not immediately discern. She clutched her bag as though it contained all her worldly possessions. The atmosphere in the compartment had shifted. The colonel's geniality had evaporated, replaced by a stiff politeness that suggested he found the presence of a strange woman an intrusion. Mrs. Carroway radiated an anxiety so pronounced it seemed to fill the small space like an oppressive fog. Poirot, always sensitive to the currents beneath the surface of human interaction, felt the small hairs at the back of his neck prickle. Something was not quite right. But then, when was it ever? The train pressed northward through the thickening snow. Darkness would fall early on this December afternoon, and with it, Poirot suspected, would come events that might disturb the peaceful celebration of Christmas for all aboard the Midland Express. In the corridor outside, he glimpsed Sir Gerald Ashford passing, the leather case still firmly in his grasp, followed at a discreet distance by the young woman who had been with him at the station. A man with something to guard, and a man with something to fear. Often, in Poirot's experience, they were one and the same. The little Belgian detective settled more deeply into his seat and closed his eyes, but he was not sleeping, indeed not. The little grey cells, they were very much awake, already beginning to receive impressions, to catalogue details, to note the small inconsistencies that might, or might not, prove significant. Outside, the snow fell faster, and the train pushed through it like a ship through heavy seas, bearing its cargo of hopes, secrets, and destinations both planned and unforeseen. Chapter 2. Christmas Spirits. The dining carriage was a triumph of Edwardian elegance, all polished mahogany and gleaming brass, with crisp white linen upon the tables, and the gentle sway of the train lending a certain maritime quality to the proceedings. Poirot had made his way there at precisely 4 o'clock. Finding that the hour had brought out a goodly number of his fellow travellers, all apparently desirous of tea and, perhaps more tellingly, of company. The snow continued to fall outside the windows, transforming the Midlands into an endless expanse of white, punctuated only by the occasional farmhouse or copse of trees, dark against the gathering dusk. Poirot selected a table with the care of a chess master, positioning his pieces, and had scarcely seated himself when a steward appeared bearing a silver tray. "Tea, sir, and we have mince pies, fresh from the kitchen. Very seasonal, if I may say so. You may say so, indeed. I will take the tea, but perhaps not the mince pie. My digestion, she must be considered." The steward nodded with the gravity of one accustomed to the peculiarities of foreign gentlemen and withdrew. Poirot surveyed the carriage with interest. Sir Gerald Ashford occupied a table near the centre of the carriage, a position that allowed him to hold court, as it were. The The leather dispatch case rested on the seat beside him, and his hand occasionally drifted toward it in a proprietary gesture. The young woman who'd been at the station sat opposite him, and Poirot noted that she had the quiet efficiency of a private secretary, attending to the small details of Sir Gerald's comfort without apparent effort. At the next table sat a man Poirot had not previously observed, though he must certainly have been aboard since Victoria. He was perhaps 45, smooth-faced and prosperous in appearance, with the careful grooming and expensive tailoring that suggested a man who had made money and wished everyone to know it. His eyes, however, just possessed a certain restlessness, darting about the carriage as though calculating the worth of every passenger. Colonel Blake entered with his customary bluster, pipe clamped between his teeth, despite the prominent notice requesting that gentlemen refrain from smoking in the dining carriage. He took a table alone, pointedly ignoring Sir Gerald's presence. Mrs. Carroway crept in last, taking the smallest table near the door as though prepared for immediate flight should circumstances require it. The steward began to circulate with a bottle. Compliments of the Midland Railway, ladies and gentlemen, a small glass of sherry to mark the season, or perhaps something stronger for those so inclined. Sir Gerald accepted with the air of one accustomed to complimentary beverages. The smooth-faced man also took a glass, as did Colonel Blake, though the latter's expression suggested he found railway sherry beneath his notice. Poirot accepted his tea and settled back to observe. It was remarkable, he reflected, how alcohol loosened tongues even when consumed in modest quantities. Already Sir Gerald was growing expansive. "A toast," he announced, raising his glass, "to prosperity and to progress. The war is behind us, gentlemen, and the future belongs to those with the vision to seize it." The smooth-faced man raised his own glass with alacrity. "Here, here, Sir Gerald. Well said, indeed." Sir Gerald smiled with the satisfaction of a man enjoying his own importance. "You'll forgive me, Mr. Foyle, if I permit myself a small indiscretion. The young lady here is Miss Pauline Webb, my invaluable secretary, and you, sir, unless I'm much mistaken, are Leonard Foyle of Foyle and Marsden." "The same, Sir Gerald. I confess I had hoped for an opportunity to speak with you during the journey. Your reputation precedes you. Does it indeed?" Sir Gerald's hand touched the dispatch case. "Well, you're not the only one interested in my affairs, Mr. Foyle. This case here contains documents that will, I believe, reshape the shipping industry for the next decade. A merger, you understand? International in scope. The announcement is to be made on Christmas Day itself. Surely not wise to travel with such important papers, Sir Gerald," Miss Webb interjected quietly. Her voice was pleasant and low, with the cultured accent of good education rather than birth. "Nonsense, Pauline. Safer with me than locked in some office safe where any enterprising thief might attempt them. Besides, I enjoy keeping my affairs close, as you well know." Foyle leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "Might one inquire as to the parties involved in this merger?" "One might inquire," Sir Gerald said with evident enjoyment, "but one would not receive an answer. Not until Christmas Day. Patience, Mr. Foyle. All in good time." Across the carriage, Colonel Blake had gone quite rigid, his knuckles white where they gripped his newspaper. Poirot, watching carefully, saw the muscle working in the Colonel's jaw, saw the way his eyes fixed upon Sir Gerald with something that might have been hatred, or might merely have been intense dislike. It was often difficult to distinguish between the two. Mrs. Carroway had declined the sherry and sat with her untouched tea, staring at Sir Gerald with an expression Poirot found hard to interpret. Fear, certainly. But fear of what? Of the man himself? Or of what he represented? The steward approached Poirot's table. "Everything satisfactory, sir. Entirely satisfactory, I thank you. Tell me, how long before we reach the next station?" "We're scheduled to stop at Derby in approximately 1 hour, sir, though the weather may cause delays. After that it's straight through to Manchester and points north, barring any difficulties with the snow." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And the sleeping arrangements, they are now in order. Indeed, sir. Berths are being prepared as we speak. First-class passengers will find their compartments converted within the hour. The train lurched suddenly, a more pronounced movement than the usual sway, and several glasses slid across tables. Sir Gerald's hand shot out to steady his dispatch case. "Just the points, ladies and gentlemen," the steward said reassuringly. "Nothing to concern yourselves with." But Poirot had seen something in that moment, something in the quick glances exchanged, the subtle shifts of position. Foyle had half risen from his seat, his attention fixed on the dispatch case. Colonel Blake had looked up sharply, his expression one of grim calculation. Even Miss Webb had reached out, not toward her own tea, but toward the case, an instinctive gesture of protection. Sir Gerald laughed, a sound without particular warmth. "You see, Pauline, everyone wishes to know what I carry. It's the curse of success, I suppose. To be envied, suspected, watched." "You make yourself conspicuous, sir," Miss Webb replied. Her tone was respectful, but contained a note of reproach. "I am conspicuous, my dear. I have earned the right to be so." The light was fading rapidly now, the brief December afternoons surrendering to evening. Outside, the snow showed no sign of diminishing. If anything, it fell more heavily, driven by a wind that was rising from the north. Poirot finished his tea and rose. The atmosphere in the dining carriage had grown close despite the winter cold pressing against the windows. It was the closeness of secrets held too tightly, of tensions wound too fine. As he made his way back toward his compartment, he passed Miss Webb in the corridor. She had left the dining carriage shortly after him. "Pardon, mademoiselle. A pleasant journey thus far, is it not?" She smiled, but her eyes were troubled. "Pleasant enough, Mr. Poirot, though I confess I shall be glad when we reach our destination. Sir Gerald becomes difficult when he travels. The excitement, you understand." "I understand perfectly," Poirot murmured. "The anticipation of success, it can make a man careless. Just so." She hesitated, then added, "He believes everyone wishes him well. It is not always the case." Before Poirot could respond, she had moved past him, her footsteps quick and light upon the carpeted floor. The little detective stood for a moment in the swaying corridor, one hand braced against the panelled wall. Through the window he could see nothing now but darkness and snow, the train a small island of light and warmth pushing through a hostile world. Greed had indeed boarded at Victoria Station. He had smelled it in the dining carriage as surely as he had smelled the sherry and the coal smoke from Colonel Blake's pipe. The question was not whether something would happen, but when and in what form. He returned to his compartment to find it transformed into a sleeping berth. Neat and compact, everything in its place as he preferred. Order imposed upon chaos, but outside the chaos gathered strength. The train was slowing, the rhythm of the wheels changing. Through the window, Poirot could see the lights of Derby Station approaching through the storm. The stop, when it came, was longer than scheduled. Poirot, looking out, saw officials conferring on the platform, gesturing at the snow accumulating on the tracks ahead. A delay then, perhaps a significant one. When the train finally lurched into motion once more, it moved with less confidence, as though uncertain of its reception by the night ahead. Poirot prepared himself for bed with his usual meticulous routine, but sleep did not come easily. The train was a world unto itself now, cut off from the ordinary flow of life, bound together by rails and fate. In such a world anything might happen, and probably would. Chapter 3. Murder in the Night. Hercule Poirot was not a man given to restless nights. His habits were regular, his digestion sound, and his conscience unburdened by those small guilts that plague the ordinary sleeper. Yet on this night, sleep proved elusive. The train's rhythm had changed, become uncertain, punctuated by longer periods of near stillness followed by laboured forward motion. At 2:30 in the morning, by the illuminated dial of his travelling clock, the train shuddered to a complete halt. Poirot lay in his berth, listening. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind howling outside and the occasional groan of the carriage as it settled. No station lights penetrated the darkness. They had stopped then, in open country, trapped by the snow that had been falling with such determination since late afternoon. He heard footsteps in the corridor, the measured tread of the conductor making his rounds. A door opened and closed. Voices, low and urgent, though the words were indistinct. Then, nothing. Poirot dozed fitfully until the grey light of dawn began to seep through the blind. The train remained motionless. He performed his morning ablutions as best he could in the confined space, paying particular attention to his moustaches, which required careful waxing to maintain their perfection despite the vicissitudes of railway travel. When he emerged into the corridor at 7 o'clock, he found it already occupied. Colonel Blake stood at the far end, staring out at a landscape transformed. Snow had drifted against the sides of the carriage, and the world beyond was a featureless expanse of white beneath a leaden sky. Dreadful business, the colonel announced without preamble. Stuck here, God knows how long. Rails are buried, apparently. They're trying to get a plough engine through from Derby, but it could be hours. Most inconvenient, Poirot agreed. Though I perceive that something more than snow troubles you, Colonel. Blake turned, his face flushed. It's not just the snow. There's been... Well, they've asked me to fetch you, as it happens. The conductor said you were some sort of detective fellow, foreign police or some such. I am Hercule Poirot, formerly of the Belgian police force, now retired. But I am at your service, Colonel. What has occurred? It's Sir Gerald, in his compartment. The conductor can't rouse him, and the door's locked from the inside. They think... Well, they're not sure what to think. Poirot's interest sharpened immediately. Show me, if you please. They made their way forward through the first-class carriage. Several passengers had emerged from their berths, sensing that something was amiss. Mrs. Carroway stood wringing her hands outside her compartment. Leonard Foyle watched from his doorway with hooded eyes. The conductor, a stout man named Perkins, stood before Sir Gerald's door looking deeply uncomfortable. Behind him hovered Miss Pauline Webb, her face pale but composed. Mr. Poirot, Perkins said with evident relief, thank heavens. I've sent for the guard, but in the meantime... Well, sir, I thought perhaps you might advise. Tell me exactly what has happened. Sir Gerald ordered a nightcap before retiring, sir. Whisky and water brought to him at 11 o'clock. I checked on all first-class passengers at midnight, as is my custom. I knocked on Sir Gerald's door, and he called out that all was well. This morning at 6 I knocked again, meaning to inform him of our situation. No answer. I knocked repeatedly. Still nothing. The door is locked from the inside, sir, and he don't respond. You're certain it is locked from the inside? Quite certain, sir. The bolt is thrown. I can see the indicator from out here. Poirot examined the door. It was of solid construction. The lock mechanism visible through a small brass indicator that showed whether the bolt was engaged or withdrawn. It showed engaged. We must break in, Poirot said decisively. There is no alternative. The conductor produced a small crowbar, kept for such emergencies, and after some effort the door frame splintered and the lock gave way. The door swung inward. Sir Gerald Ashford sat in his seat by the window, upright and apparently composed, as though he had just that moment sat down. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. One hand rested on the small table, where a glass stood, perhaps a third full of amber liquid. The window blind was drawn, and the window itself firmly shut. The leather dispatch case was nowhere to be seen. Miss Webb gave a small cry and swayed. The conductor caught her arm. Steady, miss. Perhaps you'd better step back. But she pulled free and moved to Sir Gerald's side, her professional training asserting itself. She placed her fingers against his neck, felt for a pulse at the wrist, then looked up at Poirot. He's dead. Her voice was steady, though very quiet. He's been dead for hours, I should think. Poirot moved forward with care. Do not touch anything, mademoiselle. I must examine the compartment. He bent close to Sir Gerald's face, inhaling delicately. A faint scent, bitter and distinctive, caught his attention. The almond odour of cyanide, unmistakable to one who had encountered it before. He examined the glass on the table without touching it. Whiskey and water, as the conductor had said. But something else, too. Something that had dissolved into the liquid, leaving only that telltale scent. The compartment itself was in perfect order. Sir Gerald's overnight case sat on the luggage rack, unopened. His coat hung from the hook. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place, except that Sir Gerald was dead and the dispatch case had vanished. Poirot turned to the conductor. "You are certain the door was locked from the inside when you attempted to enter?" "Absolutely certain, sir. The bolt was thrown, as you saw yourself, and the window, shut tight, sir, and locked, as you can see." Poirot examined the window. It was indeed locked, the catch firmly in place. Moreover, the snow that had drifted against the outside of the carriage was undisturbed. No one had climbed in or out through this window during the night. A locked room, then, or rather, a locked compartment. Sir Gerald had secured himself inside, drunk his nightcap, and died. The classic symptoms of cyanide poisoning, the rapid death, the posture suggesting relatively little struggle. But where was the dispatch case? "Miss Webb," Poirot said gently, "when did you last see Sir Gerald alive?" She had moved to the corridor, her composure beginning to crack. I checked on him at 10 o'clock last evening. He was preparing for bed. The case was beside him on the seat. He seemed quite well, perhaps a little tired from the journey and the excitement. The nightcap, it was his custom. Yes, he always took whiskey before sleep. The conductor brought it at 11, as usual, and after that you heard nothing unusual. Nothing. I was in the next compartment. I heard him moving about for perhaps 15 minutes after the nightcap arrived. Then silence. I assumed he had fallen asleep. Colonel Blake had crowded into the doorway, his face grim. Heart failure, I should say. Man his age, excitement of travel. Probably been drinking all evening. These things happen. "Non," Poirot said quietly. "This is not heart failure, Colonel. Sir Gerald Ashford has been murdered." The word fell into the crowded space like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread outward. Mrs. Carroway, listening from the corridor, gave a small shriek. Leonard Foyle's face went pale, then quickly recovered its colour. Miss Webb closed her eyes briefly, as though the confirmation of what she had already suspected was none the less painful to hear. Murdered! Perkins, the conductor, repeated the word as though it were in a foreign language. "But how, sir? The door was locked, the window shut. No one could have got in or out." Poirot surveyed the assembled faces, reading fear, shock, calculation, and in one case something that might have been grim satisfaction. "That," he said softly, "is indeed the question. But of this much I am certain. Someone on this train poisoned Sir Gerald Ashford. Someone removed the dispatch case from this locked compartment, and someone, unless I am very much mistaken, believed they had committed the perfect crime." He paused, then added with a slight smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "They were, of course, mistaken. There is no such thing as the perfect crime. There are only imperfect criminals and occasionally imperfect detectives. Fortunately for justice, I am not among the latter." The snow continued to fall outside, and the train remained imprisoned in its frozen landscape. But inside, in the narrow confines of the first-class carriage, a different kind of storm was gathering, and its resolution would depend upon the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot. Chapter 4. Clues along the corridor. The guard arrived from the rear of the train within the quarter hour, a burly Yorkshireman named Dobson, who regarded the situation with professional pessimism. He conferred briefly with Perkins, examined Sir Gerald's body with the detachment of one who had seen death before, and turned to Poirot with a question in his eyes. "You'll be the detective gentleman, then? Hercule Poirot, at your service." "I would suggest, monsieur, that no one be permitted to leave this carriage. The murderer is among us and must remain so until we reach civilization and the proper authorities." Dobson nodded slowly. "Well, we're not going anywhere soon, that's certain. The line ahead is blocked solid. They're working to clear it, but it'll be noon at the earliest, more likely mid-afternoon. As for proper authorities, there's a constable at the next village 3 miles across the fields. I've sent word, but in this weather—" "Then we are isolated," Poirot said, "which is both disadvantage and advantage. The murderer cannot escape, but neither can we summon immediate assistance. Very well. I will require a room where I might interview the passengers privately. The dining carriage, perhaps. I'll see to it, sir." Poirot returned to Sir Gerald's compartment, where the body remained as they had found it. He studied the scene with the intensity of an artist examining a masterwork, seeking the hidden meanings beneath the obvious composition. The glass on the table drew his attention once more. He produced a clean handkerchief and with great care lifted the glass to his nose. The whisky smell was strong, but beneath it, unmistakable, was that bitter almond scent. He set the glass down precisely where he had found it. Next, the position of the body. Sir Gerald sat naturally, not slumped or contorted. A man who had drunk his nightcap and died before realizing that death approached. Cyanide worked quickly, but not always instantly. There should have been some sign of distress, some attempt to rise or call for help. Yet Sir Gerald appeared almost peaceful, as though sleep had claimed him rather than poison. Curious, Poirot murmured to himself. He examined the door mechanism carefully. The bolt had indeed been thrown from the inside. To operate it from outside would require, what? A piece of string, perhaps, or wire. He had read of such methods in the sensational press, but no, there was no evidence of any such contrivance. The bolt mechanism was simple and solid, impossible to manipulate from the corridor. The window, then? But the window was locked, and the snow outside undisturbed. Moreover, the compartment was on the side of the train facing open fields. Anyone climbing out would have left footprints in the snow, and there were none. A locked room mystery indeed. How Poirot disliked locked rooms. They suggested trickery, mechanical devices, elaborate staging. They distracted from the essential truth of human nature, which was invariably simpler and more direct than any mechanical puzzle. He turned his attention to the luggage rack. Sir Gerald's overnight case remained where Miss Webb had said it would be. Poirot opened it, finding the usual items: pyjamas, toiletries, a change of linen. Nothing remarkable. Nothing to suggest where the dispatch case might have gone. For gone it most certainly had. A case that size could not simply vanish. Someone had taken it, and recently. The question was how, and more importantly, when. Poirot made his way to the dining carriage, where Dobson had arranged a table at the far end, screened from view by a clever positioning of the heavy curtains, usually kept drawn back during daytime service. Here, the detective could interview his suspects with a degree of privacy. He began with Miss Pauline Webb, who entered with the same quiet composure she had displayed throughout. Only the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her distress. "Please, mademoiselle, be seated. I know this is difficult, but I must ask you some questions. I understand, Mr. Poirot. I wish to help in any way I can." She settled herself gracefully, her hands folded in her lap. "You were Sir Gerald's secretary for how long?" "Nearly 8 years. Since just after the war ended." "You were devoted to him, yes." A pause, brief but telling. "I was loyal to him, Mr. Poirot. Devotion is perhaps too strong a word. Sir Gerald was not an easy man to serve, but he was fair in his own way, and the position afforded me certain securities. Tell me about last evening. Every detail, s'il vous plaît." Miss Webb recounted her movements with precision. She had dined with Sir Gerald in the dining carriage, returned to her compartment at 9 o'clock, read for an hour, then checked on Sir Gerald at 10, as was her custom when they travelled. He had been preparing for bed, the dispatch case beside him. She had wished him good night and retired to her own compartment, which was adjacent to his. And after that, I heard him moving about for perhaps 15 minutes. The conductor brought his nightcap at 11. I heard them exchange a few words, heard the door close, then silence. I assumed Sir Gerald had settled for the night. You heard nothing unusual, no cry, no sound of distress, nothing at all. I fell asleep myself shortly after 11 and slept soundly until the conductor's knocking woke me this morning. Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. And the dispatch case. You knew its contents. In general terms, yes. I helped prepare some of the documents. They concerned a merger between Sir Gerald's company and a Dutch shipping concern. Very lucrative, very important. Sir Gerald intended to announce it on Christmas Day. Who else knew of this? Sir Gerald was not discreet, Mr. Poirot. He mentioned it to several people yesterday, as you may have observed. Mr. Foyle certainly knew or guessed. The Colonel... Well, that's more complicated. In what way? She hesitated, choosing her words with care. Sir Gerald and Colonel Blake had business dealings some years ago. They did not end well. The Colonel blamed Sir Gerald for certain losses he sustained. There was considerable bad feeling enough for murder. I couldn't say. But I know the Colonel was angry when he saw Sir Gerald on the train. I saw his expression. Poirot thanked her and called for Colonel Blake next. The military man entered bristling with indignation. Damned inconvenience, all of this. I've business in Manchester that won't wait. Murder rarely waits for convenience, Poirot observed mildly. Please, Colonel, tell me of your movements last night. Blake's account was less precise than Miss Webb's. He had taken dinner in his compartment, avoiding the dining carriage, had read, smoked his pipe, attempted sleep. The heat in the carriage was insufficient, the berth uncomfortable. He had risen at 1 o'clock and walked the corridor, hoping that movement might induce drowsiness. You saw no one during this walk, not a soul. The train was silent as a tomb. He paused, realizing the unfortunate choice of words. That is, everyone appeared to be sleeping. You did not pass Sir Gerald's compartment. I may have done. I wasn't paying particular attention. I walked from one end of the carriage to the other and back again. 20 minutes perhaps, and you heard nothing unusual, nothing whatsoever. Poirot let the silence extend, watching the Colonel's face. The man was hiding something, but what? Fear, guilt, or merely the natural reticence of an Englishman confronted with foreign inquisitiveness. You had business difficulties with Sir Gerald, I understand. The Colonel's face darkened. That's ancient history. 10 years ago, more. I've no interest in raking over old coals, but the coals, they were hot once, no. Hot enough. Blake's jaw set stubbornly. Sir Gerald was a scoundrel in business, Mr. Poirot. He ruined better men than himself and profited from it. But I'm not a murderer. No one has accused you, Colonel. I merely seek to understand. Then understand this. I'm glad the old devil is dead. The world's better off without him. But I didn't kill him, and I didn't take his precious case. After Blake stomped out, Poirot called for Leonard Foyle. The businessman entered with a calculated smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Terrible business, Mr. Poirot. Simply terrible. And on Christmas. Of all times. Indeed. Tell me, Monsieur Foyle, of your interest in Sir Gerald's affairs. Foyle spread his hands. No secret there. My firm has been seeking to expand into international shipping. Sir Gerald's merger would have created opportunities. I hoped to discuss partnership possibilities, and instead, he is dead, and the documents vanished. Precisely. Most unfortunate. Most unfortunate for you, one might say. Foyle's smile grew thinner. I had nothing to gain by Sir Gerald's death, I assure you. Quite the reverse. A live businessman with valuable contracts is far more useful than a dead one with missing papers. Where were you between 11 last night and 6 this morning? In my compartment, sleeping. I heard the train stop in the night but thought nothing of it. Train stop, after all. You saw no one. Heard nothing suspicious. Nothing at all. Mrs. Carroway came last, trembling and tearful. Her account was vague, contradictory. She had heard voices in the night, or thought she had. Footsteps in the corridor, or perhaps it was merely the train creaking. She had seen nothing, she insisted, nothing at all. And yet Poirot sensed she was lying. Not about the murder itself, perhaps, but about something. Some knowledge she possessed that frightened her. "Madam," he said gently, "if you know something, you must tell me. A murderer walks free among us." She shook her head violently. "I know nothing. Please, leave me be." Poirot let her go, troubled. The alibis were all essentially unprovable. The darkness, the movement of the train, the isolation of the compartments. Anyone might have been anywhere. But someone had been in Sir Gerald's compartment between 11 o'clock and 6 in the morning. Someone who had poisoned the nightcap, waited for death and stolen the dispatch case. Someone who had found a way to lock a door from the outside. Or more intriguingly, someone who had never needed to lock it at all. Chapter 5. Motives in Motion. The train remained motionless, a small world unto itself, suspended between departure and destination. Through the dining carriage windows, Poirot could see the work crew from Derby labouring with the snowplough, their figures small and remote against the white expanse. Freedom, such as it was, lay perhaps 3 or 4 hours distant. Time enough, Poirot reflected, for several more truths to emerge from their hiding places. He had requested that Perkins bring him coffee, proper coffee if such a thing existed on an English train, and to his mild surprise the conductor had produced something not entirely objectionable. Armed with this small comfort, Poirot prepared for the second round of interviews. This time he would press harder. The initial shock had worn off. People's defences would be differently arranged. And Poirot had learned long ago that motives, like archaeological layers, revealed themselves best when excavated with patience and precision. He summoned Miss Webb first. She entered with the same quiet efficiency, but Poirot detected a new wariness in her eyes. "Mademoiselle, I must ask you something of a delicate nature. Sir Gerald's will, you would have knowledge of its provisions." She stiffened slightly. "I was aware of them, yes. In my capacity as his secretary, I helped arrange certain legal matters. And his niece, Miss Margaret Ashford. She travels with him often. Actually, Miss Ashford was not on this train, Mr. Poirot. She was to meet Sir Gerald in Yorkshire for Christmas. He had written to her 2 weeks ago." "Ah, my apologies. I had assumed. But no matter. Tell me of the will." Miss Webb's composure wavered. "This is confidential information, Mr. Poirot. Confidential information about a murdered man, mademoiselle. The confidentiality, she is now of a different nature." She drew a breath. "Very well. Sir Gerald had recently revised his will. His niece Margaret, who had been his primary beneficiary, was to be substantially reduced. A trust fund only, enough for modest independence but nothing approaching the fortune she had expected. And the reason for this change? Sir Gerald felt she had disappointed him. There was some disagreement about her choice of friends, her lifestyle. He could be quite harsh in his judgments. When was this revision made? 3 weeks ago. Miss Margaret does not yet know, so she would travel to Yorkshire expecting to spend Christmas with a generous uncle, unaware that her inheritance had been cut away. Precisely. Miss Webb's voice was very quiet. It would have been a terrible shock. But she is not on this train. No, as I said. She was to meet us in Yorkshire. Then she could not have murdered him. Unless... Miss Webb stopped, her face troubled. Unless what, mademoiselle? Unless she had learned of the change somehow. But how could she? The documents were with Sir Gerald's solicitor in London, and he would never breach confidentiality. Poirot made a note in his small leather-bound notebook. "Tell me about the dispatch case, mademoiselle. Its contents, in more detail, if you please." Miss Webb seemed relieved to move to safer ground. The merger documents, as I mentioned, but also correspondence relating to certain wartime contracts. Sir Gerald was assembling evidence. Evidence of what nature? She hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. "Evidence of illegal profiteering, Mr. Poirot. During the war, certain men made fortunes by manipulating government contracts, selling inferior goods at inflated prices. Sir Gerald had proof of this, names and figures. He intended to use this information to ensure cooperation with his merger plans. Blackmail, in other words. Sir Gerald preferred to call it leverage, but yes, essentially blackmail. And who would these names include? I don't know all of them. Sir Gerald kept that information close. But I do know that Colonel Blake's name was among them. Poirot's eyebrows rose a fraction. Indeed. This becomes most interesting. After Miss Webb departed, Poirot sat in silence for several minutes, allowing the pieces to rearrange themselves in his mind. Then he called for Colonel Blake once more. The colonel entered like a man approaching a firing squad, his face set in grim lines. "More questions, I suppose. Just one or two, Colonel. Tell me about your business dealings during the war." Blake's face went rigid. "That's none of your damn business. I fear it is very much my business when it becomes a motive for murder." The colonel remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. "Very well. I supplied materials to the government. Canvas, rope, certain metal fittings for ships, standard contracts, properly negotiated, and Sir Gerald Ashford discovered irregularities, called them irregularities at any rate, accused me of substituting inferior materials, of inflating prices. He threatened exposure unless I withdrew from a contract we were both competing for. And did you? I had no choice. The man had documentation, witnesses. Whether it was all genuine, I couldn't say, but the threat of scandal was enough. I withdrew, and Sir Gerald secured the contract worth £50,000. So you had good reason to wish him dead." "I had good reason to wish him in hell," Blake said bluntly, "but I'm not a poisoner. I'm a soldier. If I'd wanted the man dead, I'd have called him out like a gentleman, not slipped poison into his whiskey like some sneaking coward." Poirot studied the colonel's face, noting the genuine anger, the affronted pride. A soldier's pride, which often valued the means as much as the end. "Very well, Colonel. You may go." Next came Leonard Foyle, his smooth urbanity showing signs of wear. Poirot wasted no time on pleasantries. "Monsieur Foyle, you failed to mention that your firm is in financial difficulty." Foyle's face paled. "I don't know what you mean. Please, do not insult my intelligence." "Your firm has been seeking investors for 6 months. The partnership with Sir Gerald's merger would have saved you from bankruptcy. Now he is dead, and your opportunity with him. You're quite wrong, Mr. Poirot. My firm is perfectly sound." "Your firm," Poirot said pleasantly, "has debts of £20,000 and assets of perhaps 12. You are, in the vernacular, desperate." Foyle's urbanity cracked. "All right. Yes, I needed that merger, needed it badly. Sir Gerald knew it too. He was going to offer me a junior partnership, a chance to participate. It would have saved everything, and without it, I'm ruined. But don't you see? That's exactly why I couldn't have killed him. Dead? He's no use to me at all. I needed him alive, needed him successful. His death destroys me as surely as it destroys him. Unless you killed him for the documents themselves. With them, you could approach the Dutch company directly, cut out Sir Gerald's estate entirely. The documents are gone, Mr. Poirot. Vanished. Fat lot of good they'd do me now." Poirot dismissed him and turned finally to Mrs. Carroway. The nervous widow entered with reluctance, twisting her handkerchief into knots. "Madam, I know you are frightened, but you must tell me what you know." Tears began to flow down her cheeks. "You don't understand. If it comes out, I'll be ruined. My late husband's reputation, my own position in society." "What will come out, madam?" She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "My husband? During the war, he was one of the men Sir Gerald had evidence against. Inferior medical supplies sold to field hospitals. Men died, Mr. Poirot. British soldiers died because my husband provided bandages that fell apart, medicines that were watered down. He made £30,000, and men died, and Sir Gerald knew this. He wrote to me 3 months ago, said he had documentation, said he would expose everything unless I paid him £10,000. I don't have £10,000, Mr. Poirot. My husband left debts, not fortune. I've been living on the charity of relatives, so you were being blackmailed. Yes. She raised her chin with a pathetic attempt at dignity. But I didn't kill him. I swear it. I couldn't. I've never hurt anyone in my life. Poirot regarded her with compassion. Madame, if you did not kill him, then you have nothing to fear from me. But I must know, did you see or hear anything unusual last night? She hesitated. I thought I heard voices. Around midnight, perhaps later, a man and a woman speaking in low tones. I couldn't make out the words. It might have been nothing, just other passengers talking. Where did these voices come from? Near Sir Gerald's compartment, I think. But I can't be certain. The train distorts sounds so. After she left, Poirot sat alone in the dining carriage, staring at the snow beyond the windows. The motives multiplied like reflections in opposing mirrors. Greed, fear, revenge, desperation. Each passenger carried a reason to wish Sir Gerald Ashford dead. But motive alone did not make a murderer. Opportunity was equally essential, and the locked compartment remained an obstacle to every theory. Unless, Poirot thought, the obstacle was itself an illusion, a misdirection as clever as any conjurer's trick. He rose and made his way back to Sir Gerald's compartment, where the body had been covered with a blanket. The guard stood outside, stolid and watchful. Poirot examined the door once more, running his fingers over the lock mechanism, the bolt, the frame. There had to be something, some detail he had missed. And then, quite suddenly, he saw it. Not the how, not yet. But the why of the how. The reason the locked room had been necessary. He smiled, very faintly. The little grey cells. They were beginning to illuminate the darkness. Chapter 6. Secrets Between the Stations. By noon, the snowplough had made sufficient progress that departure seemed imminent. The work crew had cleared the immediate obstruction, though the line ahead remained treacherous. The train manager, a harried individual who had arrived with the rescue party, informed Poirot that they would proceed slowly to the next station, where proper police authorities could be summoned. Slowly was the operative word. The train would creep forward at perhaps 15 miles per hour, testing each length of track before committing its weight. They might reach civilization by tea time, or they might not reach it until evening. The manager could offer no certainty beyond the certainty of delay. Poirot accepted this news with equanimity. Time, after all, was on his side. The murderer could not escape, and with each passing hour the strain of maintaining innocence would tell upon guilty nerves. He had requested that Perkins search the passengers' compartments in their presence, looking for the missing dispatch case. It was a delicate matter, requiring tact and the implied authority of the law. To Poirot's mild surprise, no one had objected strenuously. Even Colonel Blake, who might have been expected to bluster about rights and privileges, had merely grunted and stepped aside. The search revealed nothing. No dispatch case, no incriminating documents, no hidden caches of poison. Either the murderer had been remarkably clever in disposing of evidence, or the evidence had never been where one might expect to find it. Poirot was contemplating this conundrum when Perkins appeared with something clutched in his hand. "Mr. Poirot, sir, I found this wedged behind the radiator in the corridor, near Colonel Blake's compartment. Thought you might want to see it." He held out a telegram form, creased and slightly torn at one corner. Poirot took it carefully, unfolding it to read the typed message. "Plans discovered. Stop Ashford. Knows everything. Stop advise. Immediate action. Stop." Margaret Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Most interesting. Where precisely did you find this?" "Behind the radiator cover, sir. It had fallen down into the gap like. Easy to miss, but I was being thorough as you asked. You've done well. Please say nothing of this to anyone for the moment." After Perkins departed, Poirot studied the telegram with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. The paper was standard railway telegraph form. The message was typed, not handwritten. The date stamp showed it had been sent from London 2 days before Sir Gerald boarded the train. Margaret, the disinherited niece who was supposedly waiting in Yorkshire. But if she had sent this telegram, she knew about her uncle's plans, knew moreover about the incriminating documents he carried, and she had advised immediate action such as murder. Poirot made his way to Colonel Blake's compartment. The military man answered his knock with ill-concealed irritation. "What is it now? Haven't you pestered me enough?" "I have discovered something, Colonel, that requires explanation." Poirot displayed the telegram. "This was found near your compartment. Can you account for it?" Blake's face registered genuine surprise, followed swiftly by alarm. "I've never seen that before in my life." "Where did you say it was found?" "Behind the radiator in the corridor." "Then anyone could have dropped it there." "Doesn't prove it's mine." The telegram references plans discovered and Sir Gerald knowing everything. It also mentions someone named Margaret. The Colonel's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, realization, then calculation. "You think this is from Sir Gerald's niece? Is it not the obvious conclusion?" Blake sat down heavily on his berth. "Perhaps too obvious, Mr. Poirot. That telegram is a forgery, or I'm a Dutchman." "What makes you say so?" "Because Margaret Ashford has been abroad for 6 months. Italy, I believe. She and her uncle weren't on speaking terms even before he revised his will. Everyone who knows the family knows that, and yet you didn't mention this before. Why should I? You were asking about the people on the train, not about Sir Gerald's family history." Poirot considered this. It had the ring of truth, and yet it could equally be a clever deflection. He pocketed the telegram. "I will investigate further." "In the meantime, Colonel, I suggest you remain available for questioning." After leaving Blake, Poirot sought out Miss Webb once more. He found her in her compartment, staring out at the slowly passing landscape as the train finally began its cautious journey forward. "Mademoiselle, a question about Sir Gerald's niece. She's currently in Italy, is she not?" Miss Webb turned, her face weary. "Yes. She left in June and has been travelling on the continent since. Sir Gerald was quite displeased about it. Some unsuitable romantic entanglement, I gather. So she could not have sent a telegram from London 2 days ago. Certainly not. Why do you ask?" Poirot showed her the telegram. Her reaction was immediate and unambiguous. Shock, followed by anger. "This is false. Margaret would never—" She stopped, her professional discretion reasserting itself. That is, Margaret was not in London, and even if she were, she would not know about the documents. Sir Gerald kept that information strictly confidential. "Who did know about the documents, mademoiselle? In specificity, if you please." Miss Webb counted on her fingers. "Myself, Sir Gerald's solicitor in London, Mr. Henshaw, the Dutch partners, obviously, and perhaps 1 or 2 others whom Sir Gerald trusted with financial matters. Colonel Blake." She hesitated. Sir Gerald might have mentioned something to him, but only in the context of threats. He would not have shared details. And Mr. Foyle? Even less likely. Mr. Foyle was a supplicant, not confidant. So the telegram is a fabrication, designed to implicate either Colonel Blake or the absent Miss Margaret. It would seem so. But who would fabricate it, and why? That, mademoiselle, is indeed the question. Poirot spent the afternoon in his compartment, watching the white countryside creep past while his mind worked through the accumulated evidence. The locked room, the missing dispatch case, the forged telegram, the multiple motives. Each element seemed to point in a different direction, and yet all must ultimately converge on a single truth. He thought about Miss Webb's words. Only a few people knew about the documents. Only someone close to Sir Gerald would have understood their significance well enough to kill for them. But the locked room suggested premeditation, careful planning. Not a crime of sudden passion, but a calculated act. Someone had known they would be on this train, known Sir Gerald's habits, known how to gain access to his compartment without arousing suspicion. There was another element too that nagged at Poirot's orderly mind. The cyanide in the nightcap. Where had it come from? Cyanide was not a substance one simply purchased at the chemist's. It required access to specific trades or professions. Photography, metal plating, certain industrial processes. He made a note to inquire about each passenger's background, their professions and connections. The train lurched over a rough section of track, and Poirot's coffee cup rattled in its saucer. The movement reminded him of something, some detail he had observed but not properly registered. The glass in Sir Gerald's compartment. It had contained perhaps a third of the nightcap. A man drinking before sleep typically finished his whiskey. Why had Sir Gerald left a third of it? Unless he had begun to taste something wrong. Unless the poison had acted more quickly than the murderer anticipated. Or unless the glass had been refilled after death to create the appearance of a nightcap interrupted. Poirot sat up straighter. Yes, that felt right. The murderer had been clever, but not quite clever enough. Small details betrayed even the most careful planning. He rose and made his way once more to Sir Gerald's compartment, now empty save for the guard outside. The body had been moved to the luggage van, a makeshift morgue until proper facilities could be reached. Poirot studied the compartment with fresh eyes, the glass still on the table where he had last examined it, the seat cushions undisturbed, the luggage rack, the window, the door. And then he saw it. Not in the compartment itself, but in the corridor outside. The radiator that ran the length of the carriage providing heat to the compartments. Standard railway equipment, present in every first-class carriage. But in the corridor outside Sir Gerald's compartment, there was something else. A small hook, the sort used for hanging coats or umbrellas, positioned just above the radiator. A hook that would allow someone to reach into a compartment through a transom window if the transom were open. Poirot looked up. Above Sir Gerald's door was indeed a transom, a small hinged window for ventilation. It was currently closed, but it could be opened from either side. Had it been open last night? He would need to confirm this, but already the mechanism of the crime was becoming clearer. Not a locked room at all, but a room locked after the fact. Someone had poisoned Sir Gerald, waited for death, then arranged the scene to suggest an impossible crime. But who? Who had the access, the knowledge, the cold nerve to commit such an act? The answer, when it came, was both surprising and inevitable. He had been observing her all along, noting her efficiency, her calm competence, her devotion to duty. Miss Pauline Webb, the perfect secretary, who had constant access to Sir Gerald's compartment without arousing suspicion, who knew his habits, his routines, his vulnerabilities, who understood the value of the documents and where they would be kept. But Poirot needed proof, and he needed to understand the why as well as the how. The train crept onward through the gathering dusk, and Poirot prepared for the final confrontation. Chapter 7. A second attempt. The train had managed perhaps 10 miles of progress when the failing light and worsening conditions forced it to halt once more. They had reached a small wayside station, little more than a platform and a waiting room, but it offered at least the comfort of shelter and the promise of eventual rescue. The station master, a taciturn individual named Griggs, informed them that the local constable had been notified and would arrive as soon as the roads were passable, which given the state of the roads might be tomorrow morning. The passengers received this news with varying degrees of dismay. The prospect of spending another night aboard the train with a murderer in their midst did little to soothe already frayed nerves. The dining carriage had been opened for an early supper, and Poirot observed his fellow travellers with the attention of a naturalist studying specimens in their native habitat. Mrs. Carroway picked at her food, her hands trembling each time someone passed a table. Colonel Blake ate with mechanical efficiency, his newspaper held before him like a shield. Leonard Foyle made conversation with the steward, his bonhomie somewhat forced. Only Miss Webb maintained her composure, though Poirot noted that she too seemed distracted. her gaze occasionally drifting to the windows where darkness had settled like a shroud. Poirot himself dined lightly on clear soup and a modest portion of cold chicken. His digestion, as he had mentioned to the steward, required careful management, particularly during times of mental exertion. The little grey cells consumed considerable energy, and one must fuel them appropriately but not excessively. As the supper dishes were being cleared, Perkins approached Poirot's table with a tray. "Begging your pardon, sir, but it's turned quite cold with the train standing still. The heating system doesn't work as well when we're not moving. I've prepared some hot cocoa for the first-class passengers, compliments of the railway, as it were." Poirot accepted the cup gratefully. The temperature had indeed dropped, and even his fur-lined overcoat provided insufficient protection against the creeping chill. "Most thoughtful, Perkins. You're a credit to your profession." The conductor flushed with pleasure and moved on to serve the other passengers. Poirot lifted the cup to his lips, inhaling the rich chocolate aroma, and froze. Beneath the sweetness of the cocoa, barely detectable but unmistakable to one who had encountered it before, was that same bitter almond scent. Faint, masked by the chocolate, but present nonetheless. Cyanide. Poirot set the cup down with exquisite care, his hand perfectly steady despite the sudden racing of his heart. He looked around the dining carriage, studying each face in turn. Who had access to his cocoa? Who had known which cup was intended for him? Perkins was serving Mrs. Carroway at the far end of the carriage. Miss Webb sat alone at her table, her own cocoa untouched before her. Colonel Blake had waved the steward away, preferring his pipe to any beverage. Foyle drank his cocoa with apparent relish, already half finished. Poirot rose and walked calmly to where Perkins stood. "A word, if you please, in private." They stepped into the corridor, away from curious ears. Poirot kept his voice low and urgent. "The cocoa you brought me, where was it prepared?" "In the kitchen, sir. I made up the entire tray at once, all 6 cups together, and between the kitchen and my table, where was the tray? Why, I carried it straight through, sir, didn't set it down anywhere. You're certain of this?" Perkins frowned, thinking. "Well, I did pause just outside the kitchen for a moment. The door to the corridor was sticking, required both hands to manage it. I set the tray on the serving counter while I dealt with the door. How long? 20 seconds, perhaps 30. No more than that. And who could have seen the tray during those 20 seconds? Perkins's face paled as understanding dawned. "Anyone in the corridor, sir, or anyone who might have been watching from the kitchen entrance." Poirot nodded. "I must ask you to do something for me, and to do it without question or alarm. Take my cup of cocoa, handle it carefully, and pour it into a bottle. We will need it examined by the police. Do you understand?" The conductor swallowed hard. You think someone tried to poison you. I am quite certain of it. The same substance that killed Sir Gerald Ashford was placed in my cocoa." Perkins went white as chalk. "But, sir, that means the murderer is still trying to kill." "Precisely. Which tells us something very important. The murderer believes I am close to the truth and must be silenced. It is, in its way, a confession of sorts." Poirot returned to the dining carriage, where his absence had gone unnoticed. He resumed his seat and made a show of having finished his cocoa, dabbing his moustaches with his napkin in satisfaction. Let the murderer think the attempt had succeeded, at least for the moment. Fear would make them careless. The other passengers finished their cocoa and began to disperse. Mrs. Carroway retired immediately to her compartment. Colonel Blake announced his intention to read in the waiting room where a fire had been lit. Foyle lingered over his newspaper, and Miss Webb sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Poirot watched them all, his mind working through the implications of this second murder attempt. The method was the same, cyanide in a beverage, but the execution was less careful, more desperate. The murderer had taken a considerable risk, poisoning the cocoa when any number of people might have observed the act. Desperation, then. Fear of exposure. The murderer knew that Poirot was closing in and had acted rashly to prevent discovery. But who had the opportunity? The tray had been unattended for 30 seconds at most. Someone would need to have been positioned perfectly with the poison ready, waiting for precisely such a moment. Or someone who had been in the kitchen already, who had access and opportunity without arousing suspicion. Poirot rose and made his way to the kitchen car. The cook, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Dobbins, looked up from her washing up. "Mr. Poirot, sir?" Was the cocoa satisfactory? "Most satisfactory, thank you." "Tell me, who else has been in the kitchen this evening?" She thought for a moment. "Well, Perkins, of course, and Miss Webb came through about half an hour ago, asked if she might have a glass of water. Very polite she was, and Mr. Foyle poked his head in, wanting to know when supper would be served. No one else." "No, sir. It's been quite quiet, what with the circumstances and all." Poirot thanked her and retreated to consider this information. Miss Webb and Foyle had both been near the kitchen. Either could have slipped poison into his cocoa during those crucial seconds when Perkins struggled with the door, or for that matter, could Perkins himself be the murderer? The conductor had constant access to all compartments, knew everyone's movements, could have poisoned Sir Gerald's nightcap with ease. But no, Perkins had no apparent motive, and the murders reeked of personal grievance, not random opportunity. Poirot returned to his compartment to find Colonel Blake waiting in the corridor, his face grave. "Mr. Poirot, might I have a word?" "But of course, Colonel." Blake glanced around, ensuring privacy. "I've been thinking about this afternoon, about that telegram. I believe I know who placed it near my compartment." "Indeed. Please continue. I saw Miss Webb in the corridor last night around 1 o'clock. I was walking, as I told you, couldn't sleep. She was standing near my compartment door, appeared to be adjusting something near the radiator. When she saw me, she said she'd dropped an earring and was looking for it. Thought nothing of it at the time, but now you wonder if she was planting the telegram to cast suspicion on you?" "Exactly." Blake's voice dropped lower. "There's something else. I've been thinking about Sir Gerald's documents, the ones in the dispatch case. If they contained evidence against multiple people, myself included, then whoever stole them might have done so not for profit but for protection. To destroy evidence. An astute observation, Colonel. And if that were the motive, who would have the most to lose?" Blake hesitated. "I can't say for certain, but Miss Webb had access to all of Sir Gerald's papers. If he planned to use her as a scapegoat, to claim she had been responsible for any irregularities, she would have every reason to silence him and destroy the evidence." Poirot completed the thought. After Blake departed, Poirot sat in the growing darkness, the pieces arranging themselves with increasing clarity. The second poisoning attempt had been revealing in multiple ways. It showed desperation, yes, but also a certain consistency of method. Someone who had access to cyanide, who knew how to use it, who could move through the train without arousing suspicion. Miss Pauline Webb fit every criterion, but Poirot required more than suspicion. He required proof, and he required understanding. What had driven a woman of such evident capability and composure to commit murder? The answer, he suspected, lay in those missing documents. Not in their commercial value, but in what they might reveal about loyalties betrayed and trust violated. Tomorrow, when the constable arrived, there would be official procedures, formal arrests, legal complications. But tonight, aboard this stranded train, Poirot had the advantage of isolation and immediacy. Tonight he would confront the murderer and extract a confession. The alternative, after all, was to spend another night wondering whether his breakfast coffee might be his last. And that, Hercule Poirot decided, was quite unacceptable. Chapter 8. Reconstructing the Night. Poirot did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his compartment with a blanket around his shoulders and his travelling clock ticking steadily on the small table, reconstructing the crime with the methodical precision that had made his reputation. The facts first, stripped of speculation and emotion. Sir Gerald Ashford had retired to his compartment at approximately 10:30 in the evening. Miss Webb had checked on him at 10 o'clock and found him well, preparing for bed. At 11 o'clock, Perkins had delivered the nightcap, whiskey and water, as was Sir Gerald's custom. The conductor had knocked at midnight and received a response confirming all was well. By 6 o'clock the following morning, Sir Gerald was dead, poisoned by cyanide, the dispatch case missing, and the compartment locked from the inside. But when, precisely, had death occurred? Poirot considered the medical evidence such as it was. Rigor mortis had been present when the body was discovered, suggesting death had occurred at least 4 to 6 hours earlier. That placed the time of death between midnight and 2 in the morning. The conductor had heard Sir Gerald's voice at midnight. Or had he? Poirot made a note to verify this detail. Had Perkins actually heard words, or merely a sound that might have been words? The human ear was remarkably susceptible to hearing what it expected to hear. Next, the method of poisoning. Cyanide worked quickly within minutes of ingestion. Yet Sir Gerald had been found seated normally, the glass still on his table. A man dying of cyanide poisoning typically showed signs of distress, gasping, convulsions, an attempt to seek help. Unless the dose had been massive, overwhelming the system before any reaction was possible, or unless Sir Gerald had been unconscious when the poison was administered. Poirot sat up straighter. Yes, that felt right. A sleeping draught in the whiskey first, something to ensure Sir Gerald would not resist or cry out. Then, once unconscious, the cyanide administered to ensure death. The glass refilled afterward with poisoned whiskey to create the appearance that Sir Gerald had drunk it himself. Clever, but not quite clever enough. The quantity of liquid in the glass had been wrong. Too little for a man who had just begun drinking. Too much for one who had nearly finished. A detail that might escape casual observation but not the scrutiny of Hercule Poirot. Now, the locked room. How had the murderer gained entry and then created the illusion of a door locked from within? The bolt mechanism had been genuine. No sign of tampering or mechanical trickery. The window had been shut and locked, the snow outside undisturbed. Yet someone had entered, committed murder, and departed, leaving the compartment sealed. Poirot rose and made his way quietly through the sleeping train to Sir Gerald's compartment. The guard dozed at his post, waking with a start as Poirot approached. "Forgive me, I must examine the compartment once more. At this hour, sir?" "Murder keeps no office hours," Poirot replied mildly. Inside the compartment he studied the transom window above the door. It was perhaps 18 inches wide and 10 inches tall, hinged at the top, with a small catch to hold it open for ventilation. Poirot stood on the seat and examined the catch carefully. There, a faint scratch on the metal, barely visible. Recent, the brass still bright where something had scraped against it. He climbed down and examined the door's bolt mechanism from the corridor side. Standard railway issue, operated by a simple sliding bolt on the inside. But the bolt itself protruded slightly through the door frame when engaged, the metal tab visible from the corridor. Poirot produced a length of string from his pocket, thin but strong. He tied a small loop in one end, then reached up and opened the transom. The hinge creaked softly but moved freely. From the corridor, standing on tiptoe, Poirot could just reach through the transom into the compartment. His arm was long enough to reach the bolt mechanism on the inside of the door. With the string looped around the bolt tab, a quick pull would slide the bolt closed. A slight adjustment, and the string could be removed, leaving no trace. Almost no trace. But there was that scratch on the transom catch where the string had rubbed against it during manipulation. Poirot smiled with satisfaction. The locked room was explained. The murderer had entered Sir Gerald's compartment with a key, committed the crime, exited, then reached through the transom to slide the bolt closed from outside, creating the illusion of a door locked from within. But how had the murderer obtained a key? The answer, when he considered it, was obvious. Miss Webb, a Sir Gerald secretary, would have had access to his keys. She could easily have had a duplicate made, or simply borrowed his key long enough to have one cut. For a woman who managed all of Sir Gerald's affairs, obtaining such a key would have been trivial. Now, the dispatch case. When had it been removed, and where was it now? Poirot retraced the timeline. The train had come to its first halt at 2:30 in the morning. During this stop, which had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, the guards and conductor had been occupied with investigating the blockage ahead, conferring with the engine crew, attempting to determine whether they could proceed. An ideal opportunity for someone to move about the train unobserved, perhaps even to slip off into the darkness and hide something in the snow, but the snow would have shown footprints, and none had been found. Unless the dispatch case had never left the train at all. Poirot made his way through the carriages, examining them with fresh eyes. Luggage racks, storage compartments, spaces beneath seats. Where could one hide a leather case of significant size? In the lavatory compartment, he noticed something he had previously overlooked. A service panel in the wall, providing access to the plumbing. He opened it carefully. Empty, save for the pipes and valves one would expect. But the space was large enough to accommodate a dispatch case, and Miss Webb would have known about such spaces, would have travelled this route often enough to know every hiding place aboard a railway carriage. Poirot moved on to the kitchen car. Here too were service areas, storage cupboards, spaces where items might be concealed. Mrs. Dobbins had mentioned that Miss Webb had come through asking for water. An innocent request, or an opportunity to hide the stolen case. He examined the cold storage area where fresh supplies were kept. At the back, behind a crate of vegetables, he found a narrow gap between the crate and the wall. And there, wedged into that gap, was the leather dispatch case. Poirot extracted it carefully, his heart racing with the thrill of confirmation. The case was locked, but that was a detail for later. The important thing was that it had been found, precisely where his reasoning had suggested it would be. He carried it back to his compartment as dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the windows. Inside, he forced the lock with a penknife, a regrettable violation of property but justified by circumstance. The documents were as Miss Webb had described them. Details of the merger, yes, but also comprehensive evidence of wartime profiteering. Lists of names, companies, amounts. Sir Gerald had been assembling a dossier of extraordinary thoroughness, enough to ruin dozens of men if made public. Colonel Blake's name appeared, as expected. So did the late Mr. Carraway's. But there, toward the end of the list, was another name that caught Poirot's attention. James Webb, Managing Director, Webb Industrial Supplies, convicted of fraud and profiteering 1919, sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, died in prison 1921. Poirot sat back, understanding flooding through him. James Webb, Pauline Webb's father or perhaps brother, a man ruined by exposure of the very crime Sir Gerald was now using to blackmail others. Sir Gerald had not merely possessed evidence against others, he had been involved in the exposure that destroyed the Webb family fortunes and reputation. And Pauline Webb had spent 8 years working for the man responsible, biding her time, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The merger had provided that opportunity. Sir Gerald had planned to use Miss Webb as his scapegoat, to claim that any irregularities in the documents were her responsibility, her fault. He would emerge clean, wealthy and triumphant, while she would face professional ruin and possibly criminal charges. She had learned of this plan. How? Perhaps she had seen correspondence, heard conversations. A good secretary learned to be invisible, to overhear things not meant for her ears, and so she had prepared her revenge. Not hot-blooded murder but cold. Calculated justice. She had obtained the poison, duplicated the key, planned every detail. The train journey provided the perfect isolated environment. The locked room would confuse investigators, buy her time, and when Poirot had appeared, asking questions, demonstrating his dangerous competence, she had attempted to silence him as well. Poirot closed the dispatch case and sat in the growing light, feeling the weight of understanding settle upon him. Murder was always a tragedy, but this case held particular sadness. Pauline Webb had been both victim and victimizer, driven to kill by a combination of past grievance and present threat. The law would not care about her motives. The law would see only murder, premeditated and cold-blooded. But Hercule Poirot, he understood. He did not excuse, but he understood. And now, he must finish what he had begun. The truth had been uncovered. All that remained was the confrontation, the confession, and the surrender to justice. He glanced at his travelling clock. 6 in the morning. In a few hours the constable would arrive. But Poirot would not wait. The time for revelation had come. He prepared himself carefully, waxing his moustaches with particular attention, donning his coat and adjusting his tie. One must face such moments properly attired, with dignity and precision. Then he went to summon Miss Pauline Webb. Chapter 9. The Compartment Confrontation. The dining carriage had been arranged with care. Poirot had requested that all the first-class passengers be assembled there at 8 o'clock, and Perkins had ensured that the request was honoured. The snow had stopped during the night, and pale winter sunshine now illuminated the carriage, throwing sharp shadows across the white tablecloths. Colonel Blake sat near the window, his face set in grim lines. Mrs. Carroway occupied a chair near the door as though poised for flight. Leonard Foyle had positioned himself at the centre, his urbane mask firmly in place but his eyes betraying anxiety. Miss Pauline Webb sat slightly apart from the others, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. The guard, Dobson, stood by the entrance, and Perkins hovered near the kitchen, ready to provide whatever assistance might be required. The dispatch case rested on the table before Poirot, its presence drawing every eye. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the carriage. "I have asked you here because I am now in a position to explain the death of Sir Gerald Ashford and to identify his murderer." A collective intake of breath, but no one spoke. Poirot continued, "Let us begin with what appeared to be the facts. Sir Gerald retired to his locked compartment and was found dead the following morning, poisoned by cyanide, his dispatch case missing. The door had been bolted from the inside, the window shut and locked. An impossible crime, yes." He paused, allowing the tension to build. But there is no such thing as an impossible crime. There are only crimes that appear impossible until one understands the method, and in this case the method was both simple and ingenious. Miss Webb's face remained impassive, but Poirot noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped each other more tightly. The locked door was achieved through the transom window above the compartment door. The murderer entered with a duplicate key, committed the crime, exited, and then reached through the transom to slide the bolt closed from outside using a length of string. Simple, as I said, but effective. "But surely," Foyle interjected, "that would require someone with access to Sir Gerald's keys." "Precisely, monsieur. Someone who worked closely with him, who could easily have obtained such access. Someone, in fact, who managed all his affairs, and would think nothing of handling his keys." He turned to Miss Webb, who met his gaze steadily, someone like a private secretary. Miss Webb said nothing, but a faint colour touched her cheeks. The murder itself, Poirot continued, was carefully planned. Sir Gerald's nightcap was delivered by Perkins at 11 o'clock, but I believe it had already been tampered with before it left the kitchen. Not with cyanide, not yet. With a sleeping draught, something to render Sir Gerald unconscious without his knowledge. "Why a sleeping draught first?" Mrs. Carroway asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because cyanide, madam, acts quickly, but not always silently. A man who drinks cyanide may cry out, may struggle, may alert others to his distress. But a man who is already unconscious cannot cry out. The murderer wished to ensure silence." Colonel Blake leaned forward. "You're saying Sir Gerald was drugged, then poisoned while unconscious?" "Exactly so, Colonel." The murderer waited until the sleeping draught took effect, then entered the compartment with the duplicate key. Sir Gerald was moved to a seat by the window, positioned naturally. The cyanide was administered, perhaps forced down his throat, perhaps dissolved in a small amount of liquid. The murderer then refilled the glass with whiskey that had also been poisoned, creating the appearance that Sir Gerald had drunk his nightcap and died. But the conductor checked on him at midnight, Foyle said. Heard him respond. Did he? Poirot turned to Perkins. Tell us exactly what you heard, if you please. Perkins shifted uncomfortably. Well, sir, I knocked on the door and called out asking if all was well. I heard a sound from inside, like a voice saying yes or something similar. I thought nothing of it at the time. You thought you heard a voice, Poirot corrected gently. But did you hear words, or merely a sound that you interpreted as words? The conductor's face fell. Now that you mention it, sir, it might have been just a sound, a cough or a groan. I assumed it was Sir Gerald responding. An assumption the murderer encouraged, Poirot said. A simple noise was enough to satisfy the conductor, to establish that Sir Gerald was alive at midnight. In reality, he was already dead, poisoned perhaps an hour earlier. Mrs. Carroway pressed a handkerchief to her lips. How horrible! How perfectly horrible! The dispatch case was taken during the first halt when the train stopped at 2:30. The guards were occupied, the passengers asleep or assumed to be so. The murderer removed the case and hid it aboard the train, knowing that a search would eventually be conducted but gambling that it would not be thorough enough. And where was it hidden? Blake demanded. In the kitchen car behind a crate of vegetables. A temporary hiding place, I suspect. The murderer intended to remove it permanently when opportunity arose, perhaps to bury it in the snow once the train resumed its journey and could claim to step outside at a station. Poirot picked up the dispatch case. But why steal it at all? Why not simply destroy it? Because, Monsieur Foyle, the documents it contained were valuable in two ways. First, they represented commercial opportunity, a merger worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. But second, and more importantly, they contained evidence of wartime profiteering that could ruin many people. He opened the case and extracted a sheet of paper, including evidence against the family of the murderer herself. Miss Webb's composure finally cracked. Her face went pale and her hands trembled. Pauline Webb, Poirot said, his voice gentle now, compassionate. Your father, James Webb, was exposed by Sir Gerald Ashford for fraud and profiteering during the war. He was convicted, imprisoned, and died in prison in 1921. You were 17 years old. Your family's fortune was destroyed, your name disgraced, and the man responsible was Sir Gerald Ashford. Tears began to run silently down Miss Webb's cheeks, but she made no sound. For 8 years you worked for him, the man who destroyed your father. Why? For revenge? Yes. But also because you needed the position, needed the income. You were loyal, efficient, invaluable. And all the while, you watched and waited. She found her voice, hoarse but controlled. He was going to do it again. The merger documents, they contained irregularities, minor things, errors in accounting that I had made in good faith. But Sir Gerald planned to claim they were deliberate fraud, to make me the scapegoat if anything went wrong. He told me 3 days before we left London, said if I cooperated, if I took the blame quietly, he would ensure I avoided prison. If I refused, he would destroy me completely as he had destroyed my father. So you decided to destroy him first, Poirot said quietly. I decided he would not destroy another innocent person. Miss Webb wiped her eyes with shaking hands. I obtained the cyanide from a photographer's studio months ago, prepared for when the opportunity arose. The train journey was perfect, isolated, confined. I made the duplicate key weeks earlier. I drugged the whiskey before Perkins delivered it, waited in my compartment until I knew Sir Gerald was unconscious, then carried out what needed to be done. And yesterday, when Monsieur Poirot came too close to the truth, you attempted to silence him as well. She looked at Poirot directly, her eyes filled with a terrible mixture of regret and defiance. I could not let you expose me, Not after everything. I had suffered for 8 years waiting for justice. I had earned my revenge. Revenge is not justice, mademoiselle, Poirot said sadly. Your father may have been wrongly accused, or he may have been guilty. I cannot say. But Sir Gerald Ashford, whatever his faults, did not deserve to be murdered, and I, who have done you no harm, did not deserve to be poisoned. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Carroway wept quietly. Colonel Blake stared at his hands. Foyle looked away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Miss Webb sat very straight, her composure returning by force of will. What happens now? Now, mademoiselle, we wait for the constable. You will be arrested and taken into custody. You will stand trial for murder. The law will take its course. She nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not sorry for what I did to Sir Gerald. He was a wicked man who ruined lives without remorse. But I am sorry for attempting to harm you, Mr. Poirot. That was wrong. You were only doing what your conscience required, as I was doing what mine required. Conscience, Poirot said, is a complicated thing, mademoiselle. It can guide us toward justice, or lead us into terrible error. The difficulty lies in knowing which is which. He turned to Dobson. Please escort Miss Webb to her compartment and ensure she remains there until the authorities arrive. As Miss Webb rose, she paused and looked back at Poirot. My father was innocent, Mr. Poirot. Whatever the documents say, whatever Sir Gerald claimed, my father was an honest man caught in circumstances beyond his control. He died maintaining his innocence. Perhaps he was innocent, mademoiselle, Poirot replied gently, and perhaps not. But that uncertainty does not justify murder. Two wrongs, they do not make a right, no matter how much we might wish they could. She turned away without another word, and Dobson escorted her from the carriage. The remaining passengers sat in shocked silence until Colonel Blake finally spoke. Poor devil. Can't say I condone murder, but one can understand the impulse. Understanding is not the same as excusing, Poirot said. We must understand in order to prevent, but we must never excuse. That way lies chaos. He gathered the documents back into the dispatch case. The rest of you are free to go. The police will wish to speak with you when they arrive, but you are not suspects. Sir Gerald Ashford was not a good man, but he was still a man, and his death was still murder. Let us remember that. As the passengers filed out, Poirot remained alone in the dining carriage, the weak winter sun casting long shadows across the floor. Justice had been served, but it brought him no joy. It never did. Murder, he reflected, was always a tragedy. But when the murderer had themselves been victimized, when they killed not from greed or malice, but from a twisted sense of justice, the tragedy was compounded. Still, the law was the law, and Hercule Poirot served truth above all else, even when truth brought no comfort. Chapter 10. Arrival and Resolution. The local constable arrived at 9:30, a sturdy individual named Weatherby who listened to Poirot's account with the careful attention of a man accustomed to dealing with facts rather than theories. He examined the evidence, interviewed Miss Webb briefly, and took her into custody with a mixture of professional detachment and evident regret. She offered no resistance. Indeed, she seemed almost relieved, as though the burden of 8 years of concealed hatred and careful planning had finally been lifted from her shoulders. As Weatherby led her away to the waiting police motor car, which had arrived via roads finely cleared of snow, she paused and looked back at Poirot one final time. Thank you, Mr. Poirot. For what, mademoiselle? For understanding, even if you could not forgive. It is something. Poirot inclined his head but said nothing. What was there to say? He understood, yes, but understanding brought neither absolution nor comfort. By 11 o'clock the tracks ahead had been cleared sufficiently for the train to proceed. The railway authorities, mortified by the delays and the scandal of murder aboard one of their premier services, had arranged for the Midland Christmas Express to continue directly to Manchester. where those passengers bound for points north could make their connections. Poirot found himself once again sharing a compartment with Colonel Blake, though this time the atmosphere was markedly different. The Colonel seemed subdued, reflective in a way that military men often were after witnessing the consequences of conflict, even conflict of a domestic nature. "Damned shame, the whole business," Blake said, relighting his pipe. The girl was clearly driven to it. "Not that that excuses murder, mind you." "Nothing excuses murder," Poirot agreed, "but much explains it. The human heart, Colonel, it is capable of nurturing grievances for years, decades even. Miss Webb tended her hatred as carefully as a gardener tends his roses, waiting for the perfect moment to act. And Sir Gerald never suspected. Why should he? To him, Miss Webb was invisible, a mere functionary. He no more considered her capable of murder than he considered his fountain pen or his filing cabinet capable of such an act. It was his fatal error. Blake puffed on his pipe thoughtfully. "You know, I was in that dispatch case. My name. My supposed crimes during the war. Would she have exposed me if she had succeeded? I do not think so, Colonel. Her quarrel was with Sir Gerald. Not with you or the others whose names appeared in those documents. She would have destroyed them, I suspect, thrown them into a furnace somewhere, and watched justice, as she saw it, consume the evidence of Sir Gerald's villainy. Ironic, then. She killed to protect herself from being made a scapegoat, and now she'll hang for murder." "If she hangs," Poirot corrected quietly, "the courts may show mercy. She was provoked, threatened, placed in an impossible position. A good barrister might argue diminished responsibility, or at least secure a commutation of sentence. You think she deserves mercy?" Poirot considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think the law will decide what she deserves, Colonel. My role was merely to discover the truth. What society chooses to do with that truth is beyond my purview." Mrs. Carroway sought out Poirot before they reached Manchester, her face still showing the ravages of fear and sleepless nights, but with a new composure about her. "Mr. Poirot, I wanted to thank you. When Sir Gerald died, I thought I might be blamed. The blackmail, you see, it gave me motive. Indeed it did, madame. But motive without opportunity is insufficient for conviction, and you had no means of obtaining the cyanide or the duplicate key. You knew about the blackmail all along. I suspected, yes. Your fear was too pronounced to be merely the fear of a nervous traveller, but your fear was not the fear of guilt, madame. It was the fear of exposure, of shame. Very different things." She twisted her handkerchief, a gesture now familiar to Poirot. "What will happen to the documents, the evidence about my late husband?" "That is for the authorities to decide. However, I believe that the documents were Sir Gerald's private property, part of his estate. Without him to prosecute the claims they contain, they become merely historical curiosities. Your secret, madame, is likely safe." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you, Mr. Poirot. Thank you." After she departed, Poirot reflected that perhaps some good had come from this terrible affair after all. Mrs. Carroway would not have to bear the additional burden of her husband's exposure. Colonel Blake would not face ruin for wartime indiscretions, real or imagined. Even Leonard Foyle might yet salvage his business, freed from the threat of Sir Gerald's manipulations. Only Miss Webb would pay the full price, and she had known that price before she acted. The train gathered speed as the tracks improved, and the countryside began to show signs of civilization. Small villages appeared, then larger towns, their Christmas decorations visible even from the passing carriage. Church bells rang out across the snowy landscape, calling the faithful to services of celebration and hope. It was Christmas Eve, Poirot realized with a start. Amid the investigation and the confrontation, he had lost track of time. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, the day Sir Gerald had planned to announce his triumph. Instead, the announcement would be of his death. The train pulled into Manchester Piccadilly station at 2:30 in the afternoon. The platform was crowded with travellers, families reuniting, children squealing with excitement, porters wheeling luggage through the festive chaos. Poirot disembarked with his small valise, declining the offer of assistance from an overeager porter. He had missed his connection to Yorkshire, and his Christmas invitation would have to be declined with profuse apologies and a telegram explaining unavoidable delays. But as he stood on the platform watching the Midland Christmas Express being prepared for its continuing journey, he felt a deep weariness settle upon him, the weariness of one who has seen too much of human nature's darker aspects, who has peered into the abyss of motive and malice, and found it distressingly familiar. A voice interrupted his melancholy thoughts. "Mr. Poirot, forgive the intrusion." He turned to find Miss Webb's solicitor, a young man named Turnbull who had arrived on an earlier train and had been waiting to meet his client. "I wanted to ask, sir, about your testimony. When the case comes to trial, will you speak only to the facts, or will you offer your opinion on Miss Webb's state of mind?" Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. "I will speak to the facts as I must. But if the court permits, I will also speak to the circumstances that drove a respectable woman to commit murder. I will speak to Sir Gerald's character, his methods, his threats. I will ensure that the jury understands what Miss Webb faced. You believe she can be saved from the gallows. I believe that justice requires more than the mere application of law, monsieur. It requires understanding, context, mercy. Whether the courts agree with me remains to be seen." Turnbull nodded gratefully and hurried away to catch his own connection. Poirot made his way to the station hotel, where he secured a room for the night. Christmas Eve in a railway hotel was not how he had envisioned spending the holiday, but circumstances had intervened, as circumstances so often did. That evening, sitting before a modest fire in the hotel lounge, Poirot composed a letter to the Chief Inspector of the Manchester Police, formally documenting his findings and offering his continued assistance should it be required. He wrote with precision and clarity, laying out the facts in logical sequence, explaining the deductions that had led him to the truth. When he finished, he sealed the letter and set it aside for posting in the morning. From somewhere in the hotel he heard singing. Christmas carols, voices raised in celebration of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. The irony was not lost on him. Trains, he reflected, were like life itself. They gathered strangers together for brief intervals, threw them into proximity, created temporary communities bound by common destination. Some passengers carried light luggage, others heavy. Some travelled in hope, others in fear. All were subject to the same delays, the same unexpected stops, the same eventual arrival. And some, like Miss Pauline Webb, carried burdens so heavy that they could not complete the journey without catastrophe. Sir Gerald Ashford had boarded the Midland Christmas Express expecting to arrive at triumph. Instead, he had arrived at death. Miss Webb had boarded expecting to arrive at justice. Instead, she had arrived at the gallows, or at least its shadow. Only Hercule Poirot had arrived where he intended, at the truth. But the truth, as he had learned long ago, was a cold companion for Christmas. Outside the hotel windows, snow began to fall once more, gentle and clean, covering the city in white. Church bells rang midnight, announcing the arrival of Christmas Day. Poirot raised his glass of tisane in a silent toast, to truth, to justice, and to the hope that the two might occasionally coincide. Then he retired to his room, satisfied that order had been restored, that the mystery had been solved, that the proper end had been reached, as it always did when Hercule Poirot applied his little grey cells to the puzzle before him. The train of events had reached its terminus, the passengers had disembarked, the case was closed, and somewhere in the night other trains were departing on other journeys, carrying other passengers toward other destinies, some light and some dark. But that, Poirot thought as sleep finally claimed him, was a matter for another day, another investigation, another mystery. For tonight, it was enough to have served truth and done his duty, even on Christmas, especially on Christmas.